running a class? So in college, sometimes you can do that in college, where you basically just sit in the class and you learn, but you don't like have to do the assignments, you don't get grades, you don't pay for it. Which, I mean, this is how you know I'm a nerd. That's actually what I would do in life. Like if I ever won the lottery, like I would just be a professional student.
Why?
Because that's like a really easy, fun life.
Fun?
Yes. College is because you get to take classes that you care about.
Oh, that's fair.
Like once you're in college and you're taking like major specific classes that you like, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Like I'm not going back to college to be stuck in like statistics. Like, no, I'm out, dude. I don't math. That math ain't math. Whatever. Okay. So we are going to talk about Jacksonian democracy. So today and tomorrow are a lecture day. I think I went over all of this with you already, right? About schedule changes and shifts and whatnot. Okay. So here's the deal. We're going to basically cover sort of the Jacksonian era, Jacksonian democracy, and a lot of politics today and tomorrow. And then we're going to get into a lot of economics next week. Okay. And I know economics isn't very much fun for a whole bunch of you. But it is what it is. All right, so that's what we're going to cover. So we got to the end with our last year. We got basically to the end of the Monroevian era, right? So Monroe was president. We had like the era of good feelings. Everything was hunky dory. And then we're moving on in life. We have the corrupt bargain in 1824, where things actually played out the way the Founding Fathers expected them to play out. Okay? So interestingly enough, this is how things were actually supposed to be done. Okay? And what I mean when I say that is the Founding Fathers and the Constitution was a system created in which the House of Representatives was deemed to be likely to declare who the President of the United States is. Right? We did not think, the Founding Fathers, for all of their like genius and forethought, had no conceptual idea of a two-party state. They didn't realize that the ways they set things up would lead them inevitably to just a Republican and a Democratic Party. They thought there would be 4 or 5 legitimate candidates for President of the United States every year, that nobody would get a majority of the vote, and therefore it would go to the House of Representatives. Okay, that's what happens in 1824. We have 4 candidates, right? We have Jackson, Clay, John Quincy Adams, and a dude who dies, and I can't remember his name now. Once it goes to the House of Representatives, every state in the House of Representatives gets a vote. They get to choose the next president of the United States, and they can only pick amongst the top 3 candidates, and then they essentially have to compromise, right? We call this the corrupt bargain because Jackson sees it as sort of political corruption, right? Jackson was the leading vote getter, but he did not obtain a majority of the vote. He obtained only a plurality of the vote. And those are words you need to understand the different meaning of, right? A majority is by definition 50.0001%, right? It is more than half. That is the definition of a majority. The definition of a plurality is the largest number of a subset, right? So if I have 4 candidates running, one person gets 40% of the vote, one 30%, one 20%, one 10%. That's 100%, yes? Who got the majority? A, B, C, or D? Nobody. Who got the plurality? A. Do we understand? Okay, so Jackson receives a plurality of the vote only. He does not get a majority. And the House of Representatives does not want Andrew Jackson to be President of the United States. So they're going to pick John Quincy Adams, right? It looks a little shady because Clay is going to get a position in Adams' administration, and Andrew Jackson is left out in the cold. Okay? So John Quincy Adams becomes a one-term president. He is relatively worthless as far as presidents go in American history. Which is only simply to say that he doesn't accomplish a lot in terms of a presidential administration. John Quincy Adams is a wonderful statesman. He was a wonderful diplomat. He was a great ambassador. He helped, I think we talked about this, right? Like, he is one of the key architects of the Monroe Doctrine, actually. He was Secretary of State during Monroe's administration and actually helped author the Monroe Doctrine. So even though we grant the Monroe Doctrine to Monroe, John Quincy Adams, as Secretary of State, had a big hand in it. Okay? Quincy Adams does help set foreign policy moving forward in the United States for, really for the next century. Which is to say, he's going to create an isolationist foreign policy. The United States basically decides, during the Monroe administration and then throughout the remainder of the 19th century, that the U.S. is only concerned in Western Hemisphere affairs. That's it. That's it. We don't want to get involved in nothing else. All right? Adams does expand federal power, right? He does engage in some behaviors that are ultimately detrimental. He fractures sort of the Republican Party, right? We've had a long period of dominance. In fact, when you really look at the election of 1824, all four candidates are Democratic Republicans, right? There is a divide even within the Democratic Republican Party. So, again, we go back and we remember what we talked about, right? Like, Jefferson's election ushers in an era of Democratic Republican dominance, yes? John Adams, Quincy's daddy, was the only Federalist president, right? The Federalist Party is pretty much done, especially by the time we get to the War of 1812 and the Hartford Convention and them whining and wanting to get out of the Union, right? So John Quincy Adams is actually going to deal with a splintering within the Republican Party, which further complicates things for his administration and makes his administration less successful than what it could have been. Let's use that term, right? So that's going to lead to the election of 1828, which is a very important election because one of the things that happens is we begin to enter into an era or an age of modern politics. And prior to 1828, nobody sought the office of the presidency. Okay? And when I say nobody sought it, I mean, like, we didn't say we sought it. People sought it, make no mistake. They wanted that job. They wanted that prestige, right? But they always acted like people wanted me. I didn't seek this job, right? They asked, and I graciously said yes. Okay? Jackson is going to change that. Jackson begins to actually campaign. That means Jackson is going around and telling people, vote for me. Okay? That was unbecoming of the office prior to Andrew Jackson. Okay? And again, that doesn't mean campaigns didn't happen, but the campaigns that happened were James Madison, for instance, telling everybody else, hey, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. It wasn't Tom running around telling everybody how great he was. Okay? Other people did that for him by proxy. Now Jackson is going to have an active hand in this. Okay? Jackson's going to scoff at a whole bunch of different traditions as it pertains to the office of the presidency. All right? Jackson is actually viewed as a common man, as a commoner. He was born poor, right? He was born sort of in the backwoods of North Carolina. He did not grow up wealthy. He was not an elitist. He was not an elite planter, right? By some accounts, as a child, the dude was just like a straight ruffian, right? Like, bully in school, beating people up, like, not a good human being. And joins the military. That helps straighten his life out a little bit, right? And the military becomes a predominant force in Jackson's life, right? In fact, and I know you probably didn't finish the documentary last night because you had enough to write your response. I don't even remember if that documentary specifically says it, but if you get to the end of Jackson's life, right? Jackson has left the White House. He's no longer president of the United States. He goes back to his home outside of Nashville, right? When people come to visit him, right? How do they address him? So if you ran into Barack Obama right now, what do you call that man?
Mr. Barack. Obama.
Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Oh.
No, like he earned the title. Like dude is like he earned that title. Like he hold that title for the rest of his life. Now he don't hold no powers with it anymore, but he holds the title for the rest of his life. Andrew Jackson, on the other hand, right? When people came to visit on him at the end of his life, and you walked into the Hermitage, you addressed Andrew Jackson as General. That dude honestly thought General was a more prestigious title than President. Okay? Which should explain a lot to you about his personality and sort of the necessity of the military in his life. But he is very much an anti-elitist. Okay? He does not like elites. He does not like the wealthy. Again, large part of this based upon how he was born, how he grew up, how he was raised. And he is, for the most part, a self-made man. Right? He is not landed aristocracy with that sort of silver spoon concept like obviously John Quincy Adams was. Yes? Right? I mean, John Quincy Adams' daddy was president of the United States. Okay? Andrew Jackson's daddy was dead most of his life. Now, we're going to pause on Jackson. We're going to go into some other stuff that is equally as important, right? Because we're going to talk about politics and political power with Jackson and Jacksonian democracy, right? And so you need to realize that when we backtrack a little bit, during the Adams administration, right, Adams won, okay, right before he gets out of office, that dude is going to appoint John Marshall, right, who is a Federalist, to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Okay, John Marshall is Chief Justice number 4, just to put that into perspective for you. It is 1801, right? The Constitution is ratified in 1789. In 12 years, we've had 3 Chief Justices of the Supreme Court. John Marshall is going to take over in 1801. That dude is going to serve until 1836 as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And Marshall is going to be responsible for a wide variety of decisions that strengthen federal power. He is a Federalist. He believes in a strong national government. Right? He is going to use his bench, right, to increase the power of the federal government to ensure that the government grows, that power is consolidated, and that we are sort of one nation. Because again, it's important to understand early on in American history, we are not necessarily a unified country. Right? We go back to the Articles of Confederation. We were 13 independent states who had joined in a confederation essentially for common defense. That's it. Right? It might as well have been a military treaty of 13 independent countries. Right? Marshall is going to begin to change this with a number of different Supreme Court cases, with a number of different decisions. Okay? I don't care about you actually understanding them. Okay? That is for government next year when we talk about the Supremacy Clause. All right? But they're in there so that you at least have a concept of the significance or the importance of Supreme Court decisions in strengthening national power. Okay? Just so we're clear. Right? They're also going to strengthen the power of the national government through the creation of a national bank, right? And through an understanding of really the Supremacy Clause, right? So McCulloch versus Maryland is a Supreme Court case. This is actually probably one of the handful that I would want you to know, right? Essentially, you have the state of Maryland trying to sue McCulloch, who is a executor. He was on the board of the bank, right? Whatever. Okay? Dude is essentially working for the national government. The state of Maryland is suing the national government. Can they do that? No. No. Because the national government doesn't consent to it. So the national government has to consent to being sued. You can't sue the national government. Oh, don't worry. You'll learn next year. Dude, a police officer could walk in here right now, beat you to a bloody pulp, and you can't sue the dude. Why? He has what's called qualified immunity. Why? Says the United States Supreme Court.
Who the founding fathers died for?
Well, that's a conversation next year for government. We'll get there. All right. But the idea here is that we're going to strengthen the Supremacy Clause. And I need you to understand, right? Next year when I make you read the Constitution, the supremacy clause is in the Constitution, right? John Marshall is not, I mean, honestly, he's not going around just making things up, okay? I don't want you to get that idea, right? Even Marbury versus Madison and judicial review, there's nothing in the Constitution that says judicial review exists. But if you read all of the Federalist Papers, which are the essays arguing in favor of the Constitution, those essays do say, hey, by the way, we've got judicial review. Like, that's the purpose of the Supreme Court. All right? So this brings us back to the idea of real sort of Jacksonian democracy, which is the main idea that we're talking about. By the time we get to the election of Andrew Jackson, by the time we get to the mid-1820s, right, we have seen universal suffrage amongst white men, right, nearly universal suffrage amongst white men, right. We see land requirements for voting being removed, or at the very least, strictly limited, right, meaning you don't need to own 10 acres or 50 acres in order to be able to cast a vote. Right? If you own any property, you can cast a vote. Right? In many cases, you don't need to own property at all. Right? Jackson is a big proponent of it. Right? He's in favor of it. He wants to increase democracy. He wants to increase participation. He wants the average everyday man to have more of a say, thus making sort of politics more inclusive. Right? For a time, the reality is that the national government was only really concerned about or looking out for the welfare of the landed, rich aristocracy. Right? They didn't really care how you got there, but once you got there, once you were wealthy, the government worked for you. Right? Now, eventually next year we'll talk about whether or not that's still true. Okay? All right. So now, as more people begin to participate in politics, politics actually begins to become pop culture on some level, right? All of a sudden, we're going to begin engaging in politics as culture, politics as sort of meetings and social interactions, right? Politics almost becomes a social event. Right? In the 19th century, sometimes, specifically, frequently, in smaller, more rural areas, right? Election day was like a huge deal, right? Election day was a 2 or 3 day event, right? Because people would come and they would have, I mean, you know, maybe if you're in like the hills of Kentucky, right? You would have some moonshine, right? Or some whiskey that you've made out of some excess corn that you got. You would bring that and you would trade it to somebody, right? And there was almost like a little bazaar, like farmer's market or whatever you want to call it, right? The voting locations became a centralized hub of other activity, right? And not just economic activity. Yes, there was like trading and things like that going on over there, but also social activity, right? Social interaction, social engagement, right? The idea of being able to get outside of your small community, right? Or again, if you're a rural frontiersman, like, you don't have community, right? If you live out on the frontier of the United States, you lead a very isolated life. That is a lonely life. Yes, you have your wife and your children. I'm going to tell you right now, as a married man with 3 kids, sometimes I would like to spend a little bit of time with somebody other than my wife and children. And I love my wife and kids, don't get me wrong, like, awesome. But the monotony of life, you know what that word means?
No.
No? Monotony would be like the same over and over and over, right? You know what a monotone voice is?
Yes.
What I don't have.
Correct.
Right? Oh, Lord, I can't. Every now and then, people that like, people of all backgrounds passionately engage in elections. President Jackson was openly partisan. Like, I would beat myself up if I talk like that. I don't want to. Okay? But that's a monotone voice, right? It's just the same thing over and over. A monotonous life is where literally you wake up at like 6 o'clock every morning, and then you go feed the chickens, and then you milk the cow, and then you eat your breakfast, and then you do this, and then you do that, and you do that 7 days a week. Right? Over and over and over again, and there is no change. Right? And I'm going to tell you right now, I love my job. I do. I love my job. Do you think I want to be here all day, every day for like 12 hours a day?
Totally.
No. No, I would like to also be able to do other things in life. And politics becomes a social outlet. Like, we won't talk about it in much detail because I honestly don't care, and I'm basically going to like skip that whole part of U.S. history because I don't care. Religion does the same thing, right? You have like tent revivals that occur like in the countryside. Like you have ministers, like preachers that go around in the countryside and they like show up and they do their little sermon and people from all over turn up, right? And I'm gonna tell you right now, I don't believe it was because they had like the spirit fire of Jesus. No, I honestly believe that the reason that they came is because they just wanted to talk to another adult. Right? Like, we are, understand this, psychologically, we are social animals. You understand that? Okay? And again, if you don't, you'll understand this more next year when we talk government, and we talk about things like prisons and prison reform and, like, solitary confinement in prison, because, on some level, that is psychological torture. Okay? That's just not the way that we are wired as a species. Okay? So I want you to understand that that's a huge part of what is occurring during this period of time. As more people have an opportunity to participate, more people are going to do it. And yes, they are political and they are engaged politically, right? But I cannot discount the social aspect of it. Okay? Which on some level is actually problematic. Right? And I want you to understand that because if you've got a whole bunch of people showing up to vote because their buddies went to vote, what does that do to the outcome of the vote? Aaron, you know we got an election going on right now, right? Like if you and I were friends, if y'all haven't figured this out yet, I'm a very political person, right? That's why I teach government. Okay? You and I are friends, right? You follow politics? Not really, right? But Aaron and I are buddies, so I'm going to drag him to like the social event that is voting. Right? And then he gets there, and what's he likely to do? How?
With what you tell him?
He's probably going to do what I tell him, right? Like, he's probably just going to vote the way that I tell him to vote, right? Because he's not an overly political person. So as you do increase participation, that way it can have some dire outcomes in terms of, like, voting and voting participation and things like that. All right? I do need you to realize, and I know some of this we've at least talked about already, there are some anti-democratic forces within Jacksonian democracy, right? Jackson is, well, I don't want to say he's incredibly sexist. He is sexist, make no mistake about that. But the reality is most men in this day and age are, right? Okay? Like, if you don't understand, like historically, like actual history, right? Why were women not allowed to vote in the 19th century? Because what? No. Because uneducated men could vote, right? You didn't need an education to vote. Do you know what the actual rationale was?
Because we're women.
Because women have ovaries, and ovaries cause hysteria. Therefore, all women are hysterical and can't participate. Like, people really believe that.
That's wild.
It is wild. Like, it's ridiculous. Like, well, listen, we're going to talk about some of that as we move forward in this class, because I do need you to realize that, like, science is not always accurate.
Just trust the science.
Okay, we're not going to talk about that. Well, we might talk about that next year. We're definitely not talking about that this year. That's too political at this point, right? But so Jackson doesn't really care about women's rights. He doesn't care about female suffrage. He don't really care about the women. We definitely know by this point Jackson does not even not care about. He adamantly hates Native Americans.
Oh.
Right? That dude would have advocated for like the genocide of all Native Americans.
Oh.
Right? He is also a slave owner. Right? So he is certainly not an anti-slavery type individual. Okay? So there are some aspects here that are sort of anti-democratic and not increases in sort of participation, at least not across the board. Again, if you're a white dude, way better for you. So as Jackson takes office, he's got a couple of goals, right? And a significant amount of his goal is actually financial, right? There's a lot of his goals that is a financial goal that, again, harkens back to his upbringing, his poverty, his anti-elitist ideology, right? Jackson wants to see the federal government shrink. He wants to see the federal spending decrease. He wants to pay off debt. He actually wants to destroy the Bank of the United States, or specifically the Second Bank of the United States, right? He will engage in an all-out war against the Bank of the United States because he adamantly believes that that bank is a tool of the wealthy elite to further increase their own wealth at the expense of everybody else. Okay? And then obviously Jackson's going to try and take Native American land, right? But we know that well already. Okay? This is going to lead us into a period of time called the spoils system that you need to understand. Okay? So, anybody ever heard the term "to the victor go the spoils"? No? So that is an old adage. Anybody think they know what it means?
Like in when they're done in a war, the one who wins takes what's left.
Yeah. If you win, the spoils is basically like what you get out of winning. Okay, so to the victor go the spoils. So if you have won some sort of war, right, you are then the proud new owner of whatever it is that we're looking at, right? We utilize that term politically to say now that the spoils and what becomes the spoils system is essentially patronage. Okay, so that's the other word that you need to know, patronage. Patronage is the idea of putting people into office that are your friends and supporters. So as Jackson is going around actively campaigning to become president of the United States, in order to get people to help him, in order to get people like everywhere to operate as essentially cronies, right, or like employees to help advocate for his presidency, once he gets the job, he's got to hook all those people up. Right? So now he's got to provide them with jobs. Federal jobs. For which they might be grossly unqualified. Right? Like, this is the idea of the spoils system. Could Joe Biden name me the Secretary of Health and Human Services right now?
Yeah.
He could. Right? Anybody here think I'm qualified for that job?
No.
Yeah, good job. I'm definitely not qualified for that job.
What job?
The Secretary of Health and Human Services. I should not be the top doctor in America. Nope. I mean, the reality is I shouldn't even be Secretary of Education. And despite the fact that I've got over a decade in education, I should not be Secretary of Defense, despite having spent 4 years in the Marine Corps, right? Like, not qualified for these jobs. Under the spoils system, that doesn't really matter. And especially when you're talking about a whole bunch of federal bureaucratic positions for which there are no real qualifications, right? Like, there's no requirements. Do you understand that? Like, do you know what you have to do in order to be, like, President of the United States?
Don't you gotta be over like 35?
You gotta be 35 to be President of the United States.
Natural born.
You have to be a natural born citizen, and you have to have lived in the United States for at least 14 years, right? And do you know what you have to do in order to, like, be the Secretary of Health and Human Services?
Nothing.
Nothing. There's no requirements. Yes, ma'am.
So is it like a bribe?
Okay, it's interesting that you use that word. There's a lot of people that view it that way, right? And that's part of the reason why the spoils system, it's not going to last significantly long in American history, right? By the end of the 19th century, so by the end of the 1800s, the spoils system is going to go away. One, because it does look like a bribe, but then two, I mean, this is a spoiler, and we won't even really have time to talk about this in January. Like, a dude shoots the President of the United States because he didn't get a good enough job. Right? Like literally in the late 1800s, right? Late 19th century, we're going to have a guy assassinate the President of the United States because he doesn't get a nice enough job. Right? Because he's not going to get a federal position to which he thinks he is entitled. Right? So, yes, there are some people that would look at it that way as like a bribe. You help me get elected, and here's what you're going to get in return. Right? Quid pro quo would probably be the better term to use. Right? Which means you do something for me, I'm going to do something for you. Right? That's quid pro quo. Okay? And that's really what you're looking at. And it's not great. It's not great for democracy, right? Because obviously if you're appointing a whole bunch of people to positions within the federal government to which they are grossly unqualified, what happens to government?
It becomes unqualified.
It becomes terrible and inefficient and not well run. All right? Like it's not a good thing. All right, so this will bring us to the bank war. This is probably one of the biggest legacies of the Jacksonian era, right, and his presidency specifically. Okay, so Jackson is going to kill the second bank of the United States. We had created the second bank in 1812, I think, right, in order to try to fund the War of 1812. Okay. What happens then is that the bank becomes sort of its own economic authority. Okay? Do we have a national bank today? Do we have a federal Bank of the United States?
Yeah, right.
Okay, for the record, U.S. Bank, because you know there's a place called U.S. Bank, right?
Yes.
That is a privately owned company. It means it's not run by the government.
But don't we have a national bank? Like, you know, like Spain has a bank.
It's called the Fed.
What the signatures on the money?
The Fed?
The Fed, the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, that plays.
Okay, that is essentially the national bank today. Okay, and the Fed is free. We'll talk about the Fed in depth next semester, because then you'll learn why Woodrow Wilson sucks. Spoiler alert, he's the worst president in American history. Everybody should agree in their hatred of Woodrow Wilson. Oh, he did things that should make everybody mad. Liberals, conservatives, racists, anti-racists. He just pisses off everybody.
Like what?
Well, one, he actually, he screened a KKK movie in the White House.
Oh. Screen.
Put it up and let people watch a movie made by the KKK in the White House. Which is obviously then, well, maybe not obviously, but that is like a White House endorsement of the KKK. You understand that, right?
Yeah. He has supporters from where?
Well, there was some people that would like that, but there's obviously a lot of people that would hate that, right? I mean, we'll talk about it in a day.
Wait, I have a question.
But yeah, what?
Did we talk about the KKK?
Oh yeah. But it's the KKK is created after the Civil War. We'll get to them a little bit in December, right? Because they actually are created as a political organization for Democrats to try to retake control of the South and reinstitute racist policy, right? So we'll talk about it then, and then as we move into second semester, there's basically ebbs and flows of the KKK, They have power and then they go away for a little bit and then they come back and then they go away and whatnot. Alright? Alright. But again, back to the second bank, right? They're going to issue paper money. They're going to do a whole bunch of things economically for the government. And that's somewhat problematic, right? Because the Bank of the United States operates semi-independently. Okay? That's actually part of the problem with the Fed, is the Fed essentially operates independent of the United States government, yet it is the Fed that is issuing U.S. dollars. Okay? Alright, so the second bank, again, I just mentioned this, created during 1812, right? In large part in order to try to pay for the war. right? We do create paper money. There's all sorts of instances over American history in which paper money has been created. And as it has been created, we have seen what's the word I'm looking for? Instances of inflation resulting in that, right? When you flood a market with paper money, the value of the money drastically decreases, which is what's called inflation. And that's not very good. Okay? So, Jackson is eventually going to kill the bank, right? He believes that it has too much power. He believes that it is unconstitutional, right? He believes that inflation is a legitimate problem, and that you cannot print paper money, right? If you do not print paper money, what do you have to use? Anybody know? Gold and silver. Okay? All right, and again, when we get through economic history in this class, you'll learn that there are times where U.S. currency is backed by gold or backed by silver, and then there's times where it's not, and it's literally backed by nothing, and so it's utterly worthless, right? So during Jackson's administration, Congress is going to try to recharter the bank. Okay? Now, this is just an interesting fact for you to learn. A lot of the times when we create laws in the United States, laws have what are called sunset clauses, right? A sunset clause means we create a law, and then we say this law is going to exist for 10 years, 20 years, right? And then at the end of 20 years, it goes away. Okay? Give you an example here. After 9/11, we created something called the Patriot Act, which allows the United States government basically to like turn the microphone on in your phone, right, and read through your text messages and all that stuff. Okay? And we did that because, you know, terrorism, and we got to keep you safe. Right? But they were like, hey, we're going to do this for 10 years, and then at the end of 10 years, right, then we will have, like, caught the terrorists, and we don't need to worry anymore. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay? So after 10 years, the Patriot Act dies. You understand? Okay? Except it doesn't. Because what generally happens is once the government has begun to exercise some level of power, they don't want to give that power up, and they will continue to, like, extend the life of it. Okay? So we had a 20-year bank. The bank has been in existence for 20 years. Congress is going to want to extend the life of the bank, and Jackson is going to be adamant about trying to kill it, and Jackson is going to be able to kill it by the veto. Right? That is a tool, by the way, and Jackson's not that terrible with the veto. He really isn't. I want to say Jackson vetoes like 34 pieces of legislation in his 8 years. That is actually not that many compared to some presidents. You understand? But it is more than all presidents combined up to this point. Okay? So, like, 50 years of U.S. history, this dude is going to veto more stuff than anybody else or all of the people before him combined.
Dang.
What happened? There we go. All right? Some other economic problems that we have, right? There's going to be economic issues that fall into the Jackson administration, and we're going to talk about economics more next week with the second half of this, because we're going to talk about like cotton and the cotton gin and textile mills and like early industrialization and all that stuff, right? But here's what I need you to understand, okay? One, there's a concept called a tariff. Do we know what a tariff is?
Tax on imports.
Taxes on imports and exports, okay? Tariffs are actually designed, for the most part, to be protective, right? So if you put an import tariff on something, if you tax a good coming into the country, right, the general rule here, the idea here, is to try to make the product that is an American-made product more attractive financially, right? That's the idea. Okay? How many of you have to go back to the main building? That's enough of you. Yeah, we're done. Yeah, that's enough of you. We'll go ahead and stop. All right. So we'll pick up with some of this economics tomorrow. We'll be back in our regular room tomorrow. All right.